All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of Cyber Economics with Mr. Miller. As you folks are well aware, we've had a couple of weeks of absolutely nothing to do, and the district is now allowing us to do education using Google Classroom. So we're going to try to pick up where we left off, and my plan for today is simply to review the lessons that we had the last week before school, before pressing on with new material. So if you recall, we were talking about the economic philosophies of our contemporary economic um, philosophers, the 20th century economists that have made major impact on world economics. And right before the long weekend, we had just finished up talking about Ludwig von Mises. Prior to that, we had talked about John Keynes. So we will be reviewing the information on those two economists in this session. And tomorrow we will pick up with Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and Arthur Laffer before closing out the block of instruction on influential economists. So if you'll bear with me, we will press on. Reminder that we were talking about economic schools, an economic school being a group of economists, like minds and like philosophies, that band together in order to promote their particular economic viewpoints. We will be discussing the Keynesian school as well as post-Keynesian economics, which is the most popular economic school adhered to by governments around the world now. We will talk about the Austrian school, and we will talk about the Chicago school a little bit later on in the unit. So what I'm going to do today is just a review of material we've already covered. First of all, I would highly encourage you, if you haven't done so, to read the biographies of the 5 contemporary economists that I provided you in class. If you failed to take those packets home with you, that's okay. I've actually got the documents uploaded here in Google Classroom, and you can read them online. So the first economist we're going to review is John Keynes, the father of modern macroeconomics. Now, if you recall, the definition of macro is big, broad, large, as opposed to micro, which is the opposite, small, singular, isolated. Microeconomics is economics that deals with things like personal budgets, business plans, um, things that involve very few people and are very simple to apply. Macroeconomics, on the other hand, deals with economies of large groups of people, most commonly um, communities, states, nations. John Keynes and his economic philosophies are the ones that are actually adhered to by the greatest number of capitalist countries in the world today. And he had 2 major points that we talked about in class. The theory of aggregate demand and the concept of government use of monetary policy. So very quickly, we will review those points just to get you caught back up to where we ended the previous school session. So first of all, if you recall from our classical economists, there are several different types of demand that each philosopher took into account in their theories. John Keynes went one step further and proposed the theory of what's called aggregate demand. And aggregate demand is as a twofold definition. The first is the total demand for all goods and services at a given price level during a given period. So rather than isolate the idea of demand to a particular good or service, Keynes says that aggregate demand, the demand across all of the services and goods, needs to be looked at in a big picture sense. The other side of the theory is that aggregate demand does not take into account the economic situation of individuals or families. Aggregate demand takes into account the economic situation of the entire community. So you may have one wealthy person creating a significant amount of demand equal to or greater than the demand of 5 poor people who just don't have the same amount of disposable income and therefore are not spending as much in the economy. Um, the Keynesian theory ignores that economic status and focuses only on the actual demand for the collective products. So in doing that, you have to understand that the theory of aggregate demand specifically does not address your quality of life or your standard of living. It is solely concerned with how much money is being pumped into the economy by consumers. It doesn't care if it's coming from a rich man or a poor man. It doesn't matter if it's coming from somebody with disposable income or somebody going into deep debt. And it's not worried about whether you're purchasing luxuries or necessities. It is strictly focused on the amount of money being pushed into the economy in return for goods and services. The other point of aggregate demand is when you look at Keynesian theory, Keynes firmly believes that the economy is driven by the amount of money that people spend. Therefore, if people aren't spending, they are hurting the economy by reducing aggregate demand. Now, as we'll see under the government control of the monetary system proposal, Keynes is not in favor of not saving. He firmly believes that if you are making more money than you need to spend, that you should be setting some of it aside so that if a situation ever arises when you need something more expensive than what you can afford, you have a slush fund to dip into in order to continue to spend, rather than having you spend everything in the boom economy and have nothing to spend in the bust economy. But he does stress that if you are saving money that you could be spending, it is reducing the overall aggregate demand and therefore can hurt the economy. Now, when we talk about government intervention and monetary policy, Keynesianism is highly misunderstood by the very politicians who claim to practice his style of economics. So first of all, Keynes firmly believes that the more people who are employed, the more people are being paid wages, and therefore more people have disposable income. And if people have a disposable income, they're going to go out and spend that money, and they're going to stimulate the economy. Keynes also believes that when wages go up, companies will look for ways to cut the number of employees that they have working in their company. They either cut jobs entirely or they reduce full-time work to part-time work in order to bring the cost of labor back down into their budgeted amount. This means that people who lose their job or who are reduced from full-time to part-time will have less disposable income and therefore be able to spend less and contribute less to the economy. So Keynes actively believed that lower wages contribute to a healthy economy by making sure that more people are employed. Now, with regards to government spending, Keynes actually says that governments should be prepared to spend into deficit in order to spark a flagging economy. So governments should be prepared to overspend, put more money into the economy than what they take out in tax revenue. He claims this is a good thing for 3 reasons. 1, corporate bailouts. If the government gives a corporation sufficient money to prevent them from declaring bankruptcy, the corporation will continue to provide the goods and services that they have been providing, which means they will also continue to employ people to produce those goods and services. In this manner, the government is able to help the economy by preventing companies from going bankrupt. More people have jobs, more people have disposable income, and more people will spend into the economy. The government will also take steps to guarantee loans. Now, this does not mean the government is giving you money. What this means is a bank is loaning you money with the promise that if you cannot repay the loan, the government will make up the difference. This is a good thing because with the government assurance of a guaranteed repayment, banks are more willing to lend money to people who they would normally not consider. This means that money is easier to get, credit is easier to get, and therefore people will have more money available to spend, more money injected into the economy, healthier economy. Additionally, when the government guarantees a loan, it's likely that the interest rate is not going to be as high because higher interest rates are a hedge against the risk of not being repaid. So with that government guarantee, banks are willing to lend money at a lower interest rate. This also means that people are more willing to borrow more money or put more purchases on credit, thus putting more money back into the economy and stimulating the economy out of a recession. Now, the part that governments tend to forget is that Keynes actually advocated the government not deficit spend when there's a boom economy going on. He advocated for governments to take their excessive revenue and put it in a slush fund so that when the recession or depression happened, there would be money necessary to plug into the economy without the government having to go into debt. Keynes was very much against extended debt and very much against government debt. And that's the part that the governments tend to forget. If you look at the United States budget over the last, I don't know, 10, 12 decades, deficit spending has pretty much been the order of the day, even when the economy is doing well. We had boom economies in the 1920s, the 1950s, and the 1980s. And in all of those boom economies, the government was still spending anywhere from 20% to 80% more than what they were taking in revenue. The only surplus budget year in my lifetime was during the second Bill Clinton administration. What was that? 30 years ago or more. Also, the only time in US history that we have ever had a government with a zero debt was in the 1820s under Andrew Jackson, the guy on our $20 bill. Our government has been increasingly adding to the debt, even during boom economies, at a phenomenal rate. And if you saw the news today, or in the last couple of days, you know that Donald Trump just signed a $2 trillion stimulus bill to push money back into the economy during this pandemic in order to stimulate buying since retail sales are falling off with everybody staying at home. The government only budgeted for about a $2.4 trillion revenue We were already at 2.9 trillion in forecast spending, and we have now added 2 trillion more to that, meaning we are now at 120% of revenue for this budget year. Had we been socking money away during the last 5 years in the boom economy, it's highly likely that the government would not have had to add $2 trillion in debt in order to be able to push that money back into the economy. Last but not least, the control of interest rates. The government does this through an organization called the Federal Reserve, which is a private bank under contract by the United States government to control the money supply. So the Federal Reserve is a bank that lends money to other banks. They basically control the entry into circulation of all new currency, but also they set what's called the prime lending rate. The prime lending rate is the interest rate that banks charge each other on money that they lend back and forth. What's also important about it for our purposes, though, is that all other credit rates are based on the prime lending rate. So if you go to get a credit card, a mortgage, a student loan, an automobile loan, a debt consolidation loan, all of these means of credit are based on a factor set by the prime lending rate. So when the prime rate is very low, interest rates on other forms of credit are very low. And again, this allows money to be borrowed easily and used to inject into the economy. There is a risk, though, if the rates get too low and money gets too easy, that demand will outstrip supply and prices will start to rise. And that causes inflation. So when we talk about control of the interest rates, we talk about having to control them both down and up. If prices start to inflate, you'll see the Fed start to slowly increase that prime lending rate to drive up interest rates across the board in an effort to slow down the flow of money into the economy and hopefully stabilize prices at an equilibrium price and keep inflation in check. The second economist we talked about before the break was Ludwig von Mises, one of the 4 founders of the Austrian School of Economics. And we talked about the 3 concepts that he promoted: laissez-faire economics, the fact that business cycles, the cycle of business boom and bust, is caused by uncontrolled expansion of bank credit. This ties back to government control of interest rates. And the idea that socialism, which involves planned economies, must fail economically. So let's look at von Mises and the Austrian school real quick. You may remember that the Austrian school focuses very heavily on the idea that individuals are best equipped to determine what they want or need in the economy. That governments cannot reliably predict what the populace is going to want to buy. Therefore, all social phenomena result from the actions and motivations of individuals, not governments. And the Austrian school, on the basis of that cornerstone, developed 3 economic principles. Let's look at each one of those 3 principles in order. The subjective theory of value is the idea that a good or service is not worth the sum total of labor and materials used to produce it. It is worth what somebody is willing to pay for it. The value of a good or service is determined by how much somebody is willing to pay. And a good example of that is the solid gold toilet seat. Yes, somebody actually produced a solid gold toilet seat. In the one example that I'm familiar with, they used tens of thousands of dollars worth of gold. They used many, many hours of skilled labor to produce this solid gold toilet seat. They priced it in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And to the best of my knowledge, nobody has ever purchased it. And why would you? Nobody has friends over to say, oh, look at my beautiful solid gold toilet seat. Toilet seats have a utilitarian purpose, and the fact that you have one worth $500,000 made out of solid gold does not mean that the value of the seat is the same as the cost to produce it. So the example we used in class was the example of a swap meet, where people take things that they no longer want or need and try to trade them with other people for things that they do want or need. And the subjective value is what I have in my hand that I don't want is worth very little to me. But I might be able to trade it to somebody who has something I do want, which is more valuable to me because it's something I want or need. And therefore, I've gotten rid of something I don't value to gain something I do value. The person that I've traded with also got rid of something he did not value in return for something that he does value. So we both walk away from the exchange thinking that we got the better deal. Value is subjective, and therefore equilibrium price is subject to the subjective theory of value. We also talked about marginalism and price theory, and this was the idea that discrepancies in values of goods or services can be due not to their primary purpose, but to their secondary or marginal purpose. So I believe the example I used in class was a medication that I take that a doctor wanted to give me for an off-label use. The medication was produced for a specific medical problem, but it had a byproduct of contributing to weight loss. So he was not prescribing it to me for its intended purpose. He was prescribing it to me for its marginal purpose. And therefore, it was of a higher value to both me and my doctor based on its marginal utility. So a lot of times we have items that we use for other than their intended purpose. How many times have you used toilet paper or paper towels as a Kleenex? How many times have you used nail polish as a touch-up for chipped paint? So on and so forth. These secondary uses add to the value of an item on the basis of their marginal utility. Now, that being said, there is what's called the law of diminishing marginal utility, also known as Gossen's first law. This example in class, if you remember, we talked about people coming in from a hot, sweaty activity, mowing the lawn, track meet, whatever, reaching into the refrigerator, pulling out that ice cold can of soda pop and downing it. The first can is just absolutely wonderful. It's cold, it's wet, it's good tasting, and it's just really, really satisfying. But if you continue to drink ice cold cans of soda, by the time you get to the third or fourth can, it just doesn't have the same effect. By the fifth or sixth can, you're just so sick of it that you probably don't even finish the cans. So the diminishing marginal utility is that each can of soda after the first one returns a lesser value of satisfaction and therefore a diminishing utility. The Austrian school also talked about the economic calculation problem. This was not a theory, this was a criticism. So socialism dictates that governments will manage the economy. And the Austrian school highlighted two problems with this. The first problem was that it requires a government to forecast 3 to 5 years into the future what people are going to want or need. The odds that the government is correctly forecasting are very low, especially in countries with a larger, more diverse population. In cases like that, they frequently have to plan for the lowest common denominator, and that frequently leaves out a significant percentage of the population that throws off their calculations immensely. The second problem is that once they've made their prediction, they have to commit resources to producing the goods and services that they have predicted will be wanted or needed. Once those resources are allocated, they cannot be reallocated quickly, which means we may spend years producing things that nobody wants, only to find out that we no longer have the capability to produce things that people do want. And we therefore wind up with a surplus of useless goods and a shortage of necessities. That led to von Mises writing, "Rational economic activity is impossible in a socialist commonwealth." The last point that we'll touch on in review is the idea of laissez-faire economics. If you recall, laissez-faire translates to let it be. It is essentially a dictate that says the government should keep their hands off the marketplace and allow a free market with both producers and consumers working towards an equilibrium price. Laissez-faire economics believes that small business people, entrepreneurs, have a much better idea of how to forecast their business plan than the government does for an entire industry across an entire nation. They believe that individuals know better what their wants and needs are than the government, which is dictating to the least common denominator across a broad, diverse population. So laissez-faire economics believes that free market competition causes a thriving economy and therefore a thriving society, and the government should keep their hands off. If you want a more detailed explanation, you can click on the two video links that I have here, and these are the videos that we saw in class, so you can take a look at those if you want to. Once again, I do encourage you to read the biographies of both von Mises and Keynes. I also encourage you to read the biography of Friedrich Augustus Hayek. We will be talking about Hayek and his economic philosophy in our next video. Hayek is a student of the Austrian school and was a protege of von Mises, but he was a contemporary of John Keynes. If you remember from the Keynes video, they actually served a day of bomber watch together in London during World War II. So we will be talking about him tomorrow. In the meantime, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to enter them into the comment block on the Google Classroom page. And keep in mind that any comments or questions that you put down are visible to the entire class. Don't be afraid to ask any question simply because somebody else may have the same question and might be very grateful that you were the one that asked it. So if there are no other questions or comments, I look forward to our next meeting and we will get through this together. Have a good day.